righty. Well, good morning. Thank you, Brittany and Kenny as well for having me back. Well, I should say thank you for having me back as well. And it's a joy to be here with you all. And I'm really, really excited. So let's do this just for laughs for just 2 seconds worth. For those that are older in the room, I want you to think back to a time when you were like 16 to like young 20s. Think about a job that you had that brought out the worst in you. And then turn to your neighbor. Like, for example, when I was, in my young 20s, I was a limo driver. And that was a disaster job. And so, because I'm terrible with directions and everything else. So, turn to your neighbor and just tell them, what was that worst job that you had when you were 16 to 20-ish? Go for it, really quick. All righty. Well, being a limo driver wasn't the worst job. The job that I had that brought out the worst in me was working at Chuck E. Cheese. And, when I was working at Chuck E. Cheese, I was a youth pastor at the time, and you would have not known that because you would have thought I hated kids by my expressions when I would go to work at Chuck E. Cheese. I remember there was one weekend that I was off, and I was going to go with my college friends. We were going to go up to Vegas, and one of them, who was a believer, decided to pass. And he looked at me, and he's like, dude, Vegas, that's like a den of sin. And I remember thinking to myself, den of sin? No, that would be Chuck E. Cheese, where I worked. That's that place. And so I had to dress up, and one day, I was the purple character. Munch is his name. And so I put on the costume, and I come outside, and there's screaming kids everywhere, and kids run behind you, and they're like kicking you in the behind. And I was escorted to where this birthday party was, and they're like, Lloyd, say happy birthday, but I can't see. The eye holes are in the mouth. I'm 6'2". The costume was designed for not 6'2". And so no clue. And I was like, happy birthday. And they're like, wave at the kids. I'm like, I can't see the kids. They're like, and the person who's escorting me is like, just wave. They're right in front of you. I'm like, all right, happy birthday. And I'm just waving frantically, not realizing I'm just knocking kids on the ground like they're bowling pins. The worst job in the world. It brought out the worst in me, but the season that I was in was also a really challenging season. In a season where I was in this new ministry and really jealous and really coveting and really desiring other friends of mine that had landed gigs and church ministry that could pay what they needed to pay, and they didn't need to have a side gig. And here I was having to do a side gig and dress up in this outfit each day, and man, it just raked on my nerves so much. And additionally to that, I just remembered that in this season of the anger and just this lack of joy that was inside of me, and I would get together with a group of friends for accountability, and they would, in their best attempts to try and disciple and to guide me, and they were trying to encourage me with my, put on a godly attitude when you go, and how do you manage the anger? And so it was a lot of maybe management and a lot of try these extra added things to try and navigate this season of frustration and anger and disappointment that I was experiencing. As we come to the text today, there's something that's really powerful in it, because Paul is going to remind us that the law and God's commands are crucial, but one thing that could be really missing is the whole point of the law. And I think that was the missing ingredient, even for me back then, and even to this day, that I still have to go back and remind myself, wait, the whole point here is love. And that is the aim, and that is the goal. And Paul is reminding them that as we look at the text today, he's saying that love is the actual fulfillment of the law. And I think that we get this kind of flipped and we get it backwards and we go out as if imagine me driving to work and like, okay, I gotta love these kids. As if it's some switch that I just flip on and walk inside and all of a sudden I'm filled with love. It doesn't work in that way. Romans chapter 5, it says that Christ's love has been poured on us through the Holy Spirit. And the way that this flows in me is now to flow out of me. And I think we're very backwards at times when we are trying to make this happen in a very performance type of way. Where Christ is saying, no, you're missing the point. And I think that even with me growing up in a Christian home and hearing all the time about, love is a decision. And yes, there's some truth, but I think there's a half-truth in that statement. How attuned am I to the love that's being poured in? Am I attentive to that in a way that it's now seeping out of me onto others? So, as we take a look at love being really the direction and this fulfillment, that it's not just a love also that is some noble concept. It's not a love that is filled with vague sentimentality. You see, there's a relationship between the law and love. Otherwise, it just stays in this arena of this abstraction, and we never really love. But to go and be so hyper-focused on getting it right, we lose the real essence of what it means to love. So they work in togetherness, with love being the actual attainment and the fulfillment and the summation of it all. That's where I want to take us this morning into this journey. Will you bow with me in a word of prayer before we dive into the passage? Father, we thank you so much, Lord, for where you are going to take us in these next few minutes. Lord, that even as we open up your word this morning, that this is a way of how we receive love from you. Lord, how you want to feed us this morning with your words and your truth. So Lord, will you enlighten us? Will you stir inside of us these words that we're about to read? In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Romans 13, verse 8. Look with me there. It says here, owe no one anything except to love one another. For the one who loves another has fulfilled the law. Owe no one anything. So, talking about this obligations of debt, which is really interesting because in Romans 13, 1 through 7, he's talking about these civic responsibilities, and he ends in verse 7, if you'll notice there, right up above it, pay to all what is due them, so that you have no debt, you have no outstanding obligation. And then verse 8, he goes back into that same language, except this time there's like a little pun on the word of obligation. So, you don't owe anyone anything except to love one another. So in this obligation, now, it's almost as if he's saying in verse 7, do what you can to pay everybody what you owe so you can be freed up in a way that now you can pour all your time and energy into loving one another, a debt that actually never gets paid. Wow, this becomes really intense when you start to think about this. Owe no one anything except to love them. I know for me, this last week, the Lord really brought a lot of conviction to me in this area. Because I started thinking about all these relational dynamics in my life. And I thought that I spend a really significant amount of time maybe categorizing the relationships that I'm in. Maybe as I took a look at these relationships, that I'm always thinking, how do I navigate this? Or I'm always defining the type of relationship that I'm in. For example, even this last week, my wife and I, we have this little tiny cabin that we rent out, and there was a conflict with the person who's renting, and all of a sudden I'm thinking, okay, now how do I navigate this in a way that there's boundaries and there's healthy places here that we don't overstep each other's boundaries and we're respecting each other and that I don't get taken advantage and wait a minute, as I start to think about these categories and the definition of the relationship, that love kind of maybe gets off to the side. Oh, but then I might make a nice gesture and think, oh, okay, I did it. Because I added this nice gesture in my conversation, therefore I did a loving thing, and I've crossed off the list of being loving. That's not what Paul is getting at here. In this obligation to love one another, Christ demonstrated his love for us, that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. Man, one of the categories I use all the time in so many of my relationships is, well, this relationship is complicated. While we were yet complicated, Christ died for us. So I think that this verse spills over in a way where Paul's reminding us, no, get love back into the thrust, into the center of the relationship. Yes, relationships are complicated. Yes, they're messy, and yes, they have lots of different definitions from bosses and subordinates and those kinds of things. All that is true and all that exists, but love goes right through all of that. And so the obligation to love one another is really fascinating. The one another, Paul uses this a lot in his writings, and 90% of the time when he uses that phrase, one another, he's in reference to the Christian community. So here we are, Remembrance Church, as a body that we have gathered, and Paul's reminding us that in this room, there's this obligation to love one another. And I love the one another because in the Greek, it's a reciprocal pronoun, meaning this: there's a mutuality happening in the exact same timing. So that means that we're coming together in this mission together with the same goal and the same intentions of being loving towards one another. Now, Paul is not saying that this is only for the Christian community, because he's going to pan out in verse 8, owe to no one anything except to love one another. For the one who loves another, now he pans out, and the word another is actually neighbor. You know what's really fascinating is when you take a look in Romans chapter 12, when I was here last night, I even spoke on it, when it says to practice hospitality. You know what hospitality, the actual word is? Love the stranger. So, again, personally, I just think evangelism, probably the best ways that we do it is through hospitality. Opening our doors and welcoming the stranger in. And so, here we have, for the one who loves another has fulfilled the law. Meaning the law has now come to its fullest completion. The point all along with the law was love. So I want to go back just real quick with me. Turn into Exodus chapter 20. So in Exodus chapter 20 is the Ten Commandments. And as we look at the Ten Commandments, I think, and I'm grateful for Walter Brueggemann, he's this Old Testament scholar, and he pointed out something that has really stuck with me and is really phenomenal. We never really discuss this much when we talk about the Ten Commandments. It's the preface to the Ten Commandments. And that preface to the Ten Commandments actually gives us the greatest, maybe, understanding of what was the heart behind the Ten Commandments. Look with me at Exodus chapter 20. Then God spoke all these words. By the way, it's not Ten Commandments, it's words. That's just something kind of nerdy. And Paul will later say that same word. But anyway, okay. Then God spoke these words. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. And then he begins with the Ten Commandments. That line that sets the stage for the understanding really captures the essence. So within the Ten Commandments, the Lord is saying, look, you're coming out of oppression. Now that you're out of oppression, I want to give you some guardrails so you don't go back into oppression. So you don't go and maybe oppress others in your freedom. The Ten Commandments were given as a way for human flourishing. The Ten Commandments were given as a gift to say, look, if you want to continue in loving relationships with one another, man, here is this guide path. Here's a way forward in doing this. And it is concrete, and it is specific. And all throughout Scripture, we see more and more ongoing statutes and ordinances and commands of God. And it can feel really like we're being pinned in. I remember years ago, I had a struggle reading Psalm 119. Psalm 119 is the longest chapter in the entire book of Psalms, and it's all about God's laws. And there's 7 or 8 different terms that are used to describe God's laws and the statutes and ordinances and some of those other words I already used. And it felt like, as I was reading it, that it felt like this gotcha moment. What I mean by that is just when I thought I was getting maybe a few of these right, I would read another one and oh wait, I'm not doing that either. And it just felt like, oh, that's like walking around the corner and God's like, gotcha. It was another scholar who said, but what if we can look at it through a different lens? And he said, what if these formidable, unbending terms actually come to us as potential friends? And then suddenly I was able to read Psalm 119 with a fresh set of eyes and to say, okay, and now when I go back to Romans 13:8, and wait, and the one who loves has fulfilled the law. As we move on to verse 9, we're going to see the commands reappear once again. Because I think as people, that we do need those concrete, specific things. Otherwise, again, the love will stay in this lofty, abstract ideal, or it'll just be some vague sentimentality. So there is these specific things that come and say this is how it is lived out, because God has a heart for justice. And in that heart for justice means that, oh wait, we need to do and act in specific ways. Well, look with me at verse 9. It says this, the commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and any other commandment, by the way, Paul says, and any other word, logos, are summed up in this word. Love your neighbor as yourself. So again, let me just take a minute and unpack a little bit more when we talk about the law and the relationship within love. Because it can be a bit of a confusing one. So for example, if you were to sit down later today and you start in Romans 1 and read to the very end, you might be very confused by Paul's discussion of the law. It feels like a very off and on relationship that Paul has, a confusing one. For example, in Romans 4, he talks about, well, adherence to the law, they don't really receive a blessing. In Romans 5:20, the more I was exposed to the law, the greater sin that happened in my life. Chapter 7, sinful pleasures aroused by the law, and then later on, chapter 7, there's all these other laws that work within my body. And then in chapter 8, talks about the law of the Spirit has set you free from the law of sin. So it can be very, again, like this dizzying kind of concept. How do these commands and these obligations, it seems like if it's an obligation, doesn't feel very loving. How does all of that work together? Well, let me maybe illustrate in this way. To think about it in two spheres. So I'll say this sphere right here, we'll call that the flesh. And this sphere over here, we'll say, is the Spirit of Christ. So when the law is over here and applied to the flesh, you lose. And that is going to lead to death, because now it has a sense of obligation and it doesn't lead to freedom. And it's unending, and how can I ever really fulfill it? It just can't. It can't be fulfilled in your flesh. So maybe I'll even call this sphere, like, maybe we'll use the word performance. So in the sphere of performance, man, these laws, these commands, it's not going to work. But over here, in this new Spirit of Christ that's at work in me, and the Spirit is now guiding me into and the obedience through these commands, well, now that's working and that's freedom, and I'm moved in this place of new love. Let me illustrate maybe in a fun kind of way too. Let's just use like maybe dating as an example for a second, okay? So when I began dating my wife, Kathy, she's not here today. She's at the retreat center where we pastor. But when I was dating her, I was on a date with her, and we were like 3-4 weeks into our dating. And so there was maybe these rules within dating. And one of those rules is pay a compliment to the one that you're on a date with. So I'm driving down the road. This is date number 3. And I'm thinking in my head, okay, man, I got to do this. I got to give a compliment. And this is what I'm supposed to do. It's the rule. It's the part of the game. And so I'm driving, and of course I'm paying attention to the road. I'm not paying attention to her. And I'm like, I got to say a compliment. Compliment her eyes. Yeah, that's what I'll do. But I have no clue what color her eyes are. So I figure, you know what? I'm going to make a good guess, an educated guess. So I'm driving. I'm like, hey, by the way, you just have the most prettiest blue eyes. And there's this silence. Kathy's eyes aren't blue. Kathy's eyes are brown, like the sand in Joshua Tree. Okay, completely opposite of this blue sky from her brown eyes of the desert floor. You know, and so I'm driving, and she looks at me, and she goes, "What color are my eyes?" To which in that moment I knew that this isn't working. Because again, here I am in this performance mode. And what happens in performance mode when it's not going to work? Well, you keep performing. And I'm like, boy, you have the most beautiful brown eyes. And no, that's not going to work. So we can, once again, go into performance mode. But I don't think performance mode is going to carry you into a really fulfilling, loving relationship with anything. Just like if I pull into Chuck E. Cheese and go into performance mode and say, I got to love these kids. I tell you, at a half hour as I go inside and the kid comes up to me and says, hey, that change machine took my $20 bill. I'm going to lose it. Like, no, it didn't. Quit lying. You're stealing. So performance has a shelf life. It just does. We just can't continue in the performance. Paul, in verse 9, the commandments, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and any other commandment, and that can feel like performance. No, it's actually, all of those commands are summed up in this: love your neighbor as yourself. Which is actually a quote out of Leviticus in the Old Testament. You know, Paul is not introducing some new law to replace the old law. He was reminding them that, look, the law was never meant to live in this sphere. The law and God's heart all along was over here. And that his love and passion for the neighbor is what drove those guardrails. And the giving of that law as gift so that the neighbor and you could be in a place of flourishing. But if that law was applied over here, it's a lose. The wages of sin is death. It doesn't work. The love of neighbor. It's really fascinating when you take a look, by the way. And if you want, let's do this really quick too. Turn with me to Leviticus 19, because that is where in the Old Testament, Paul quotes, and Jesus also, and by the way, Jesus was even redefining neighbor. And neighbor, I tell you, the Old Testament is preoccupied with neighbor. Throughout the entire Old Testament, there is so much written from Yahweh about neighbor. And so here in verse 19, he talks about the neighbor. But look with me in verse 33 and 34. When an alien resides with you in your land, you shall not oppress the alien. The alien who resides with you shall be to you as the citizen among you. You shall love the alien as yourself. Why? For you were aliens in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. Again, the love that is thrust, the love that comes through, it's the Lord looking at the whole landscape of humanity and wanting to see humans flourish in the image of God that they're made in. And in this passage within the alien, notice that to love the stranger, to love the alien, man, there's economic, there's social, there's political implications in doing this. So again, as we do this, we're not talking a vagueness and abstraction here. So there is very concrete ways in which we do this. Let's continue back through Paul's, I guess you could say, his argument. Look with me at verse 10. As he recircles what he talked about in verse 8. Actually, what he's going to do here in verse 10 is saying it to the negative. He says in the positive in verse 8, love your neighbor. And in verse 10, he's going to say it to the negative, hey, love does no harm to your neighbor. Look with me at the passage. Love does no wrong to a neighbor. Therefore, love is fulfilling of the law. And it's a really fascinating structure, I guess you could describe it in that way, that Paul does here in this verse. That almost puts a stamp on the whole argument that he's trying to make. So, in the language, in the original language, you have the word love with, I'll call what's actually not what I call it, it's actually called the article. So the verse begins with the love. So that's the flow of the passage in the very beginning. So he says, the love does no wrong to your neighbor. Then it says, therefore, the fulfilling of the law, and the last two words of verse 10 is the love. So you got this bookend in this verse. It's lost in our English translation, but it's a really fascinating construction where he begins in verse 10 and says, the love does no wrong to neighbor. It's the fulfillment of the law is the love. Love is truly the point. It truly is. And again, it's not a vagueness, but it's not a performance either. So how is it that we really, really do this? So if it's not something that I muster up on my own, then how? What truly is the pathway? To which I'll go back and say once again in Romans 5, that Christ's love has been poured out on us. You know, in Galatians, Paul will go on and he'll write and he'll talk about how we are to be led by the Spirit. And the fruit of the Spirit, the first fruit of the Spirit is love. So, I guess for me, I sat this week in a place of some conviction where I spent more time in the navigating and the defining of a relationship without asking the question, God, how is it you're loving me and that I can now love this person? And I think about, in verse 10 in particular, love does no harm. Paul would describe that later as well in 1 Corinthians 13, where he says you can do a whole bunch of great things, but man, if you don't have love, you're just a clanging bell. And I think about even with my brother who is gay, and I think back to a time when I went to him and I said, hey, I'm uncomfortable coming to your house. I don't know if God would want me to be here in this place. Well, man, talk about harm. So this quest for purity led me into a place of isolation, and I think that missed the point. That wasn't loving. And so I think we can have a preoccupation as well with rightness, where rightness overshadows loving. Yeah, there was a person that was sharing, and they were talking about their conversations, and they were really fueled by a conversation, and for them, that they didn't have any regard for trying to come the other way in their conversation with another person. And for them, they said, I'm not interested in understanding the viewpoint, that for me, this is right. And so they felt like everything was staked on it, and they felt very convicted in that they were going in really, really heavy. And I just thought, once again, wow, if we love the stranger and it has maybe economic and political and social implications, how am I willing to allow myself to be impacted by that? How am I willing to make room? Maybe one of the best ways we can disarm people is just by listening. But we're so bent on this pathway of this rightness, and really it comes down to maybe a certain agenda or maybe certain uncomfortable feelings that we have, and those uncomfortable feelings suddenly grow into biblical convictions. And no, where are we being led by love? Where are we stopping to say, Holy Spirit, are you really behind this? Or am I just off and blazing this path? And have I actually been attentive and listening enough to really know that, Spirit, this is what you're wanting me to do? I'd like to invite up the worship team to come back up. On your outlines, there are just a handful of kind of reflective questions there. And again, I know for me, this is just a place that I've just been wrestling so much in, that I really want to shake off all those categorizations and get back to a place where, God, you called me to love. And I've experienced that love. And I want that to truly drive, because it is the summary. Rightness is not the summary. That's another losing. And that, I feel like, goes back into this sphere of the flesh. That we have an agenda. Or that we have actually maybe a real frantic fear. Oh, America's losing its soul, and we've got to fight for maybe a way forward. Again, how can I love? How can I disarm the other through my love? Well, with that, I'll leave you into let you be into that space of some reflection, and as we go into a time of worship, and maybe this week to continue pondering some of those kind of questions. I've sat in it myself and wrestled with it. And it's amazing how much of me how much of me gets in the way. Like I said, the conflict that I had with this person who's this tenant, and there was so much of me. I was so worried and concerned and gripped by all these fears, and where was love? Where was God's love flowing to that person? That's where I've been sitting. Father, will you continue to draw us further into this place where, Lord, you demonstrated your love through very concrete actions. Lord, your Son who sacrificed all. Lord, the commands that we have, the commands, and there were just a handful. And those commands probably, and why Paul didn't use them all, is because maybe those 4 were likely the most 4 that particular community were wrestling with. So left to our own devices, God, we won't wind up as just loving people. We've got to keep coming back to this source of you and your love being poured through us. Lord, help release us from all the angst and the other, I'll just call them distractions and hesitations when we go to love another. Lord, if there's a hesitation, that's something in our heart that you, Holy Spirit, want to reveal. So Lord, draw us deeper into your love in such a way that your love broke through every hard surface in our life. So there be no hesitation with another. Thank you.